because it was passed just before you became government.
Honourable member for London North Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I said before that facts matter, and so let me simply read here a clear fact. Since 2016, the RCMP has charged 4 individuals for terrorism-related offences after their return to Canada. 2 of them have been successfully convicted, and the other 2 cases remain before the courts. My honourable member will note, I hope, that despite all their talk, no returned terrorists were charged under the Harper Conservatives. I'll also take the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, that this motion is draped in fear. What happened to the time when the Conservatives, not just at the federal level, but at the provincial level, actually embraced common sense solutions to very serious problems? Right. I think, for example, of John Robarts. I think, for example, of Bill Davis or Bob Stanfield or even Brian Mulroney or Joe Clark. What happened to that Conservative tradition that wanted to work constructively to address national security threats and challenges? I don't hear it on the opposite side. All I hear is fear, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To my honourable colleague from London North Centre, I appreciated his thoughtful speech. I'm just trying to figure out how, I completely agree, Mr. Speaker, with the sentiment that's been expressed by many, that we all would want to associate ourselves with the sentiments of Nadia Murad. We all recognize in her own heroic struggle a woman standing up against the horrific impact of violence and terrorism, and particularly the targeting of women and girls and using rape as an instrument of war. But I don't know how I can, in good conscience, Mr. Speaker, vote for a motion that refers to, and we know what this is coded language for the Omar Khadr case, quote, paying terrorists with taxpayers' dollars. That I don't believe was a past mistake. I believe that was the right thing to do. And I don't think that Omar Khadr meets any normal definition of terrorism, in that even if the charges against him were true, which I don't think they were, it's a war zone in which there were enemy combatants. And in our typical understanding of the term terrorism, that would not meet the definition. I'm just wondering if my friend from London North Centre has any concerns about the various ways this motion is worded to make it almost impossible to vote for it.
Honourable member for London North Centre.
As far as the wording of the motion is concerned, Mr. Speaker, what I will say is that we have to stand behind those who have defended human rights. And I mentioned in the speech, I've had the honour of meeting Nadia Murad once here in Ottawa, and in fact, in my home community of London. And so when she calls on the perpetrators of terrorism to be prosecuted, I think we have to get behind that sentiment. Where I don't agree is when some members, and I'm speaking specifically of Conservative members, have taken that thought, that very important notion that she has put forward, and transitioned it into something else. Not only today, but especially outside of this House, constantly pressing this button of fear. I go back to what I said before. I am certainly interested in hearing from members opposite, from the Conservative members. What happened to that tradition in Conservative thought that prized common sense solutions to dealing with the national security threats that we face, and getting away from fear, getting away from that entirely, and working together to find ways forward? Bill Davis, Brian Mulroney, Joe Clark, so on and so forth. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Medicine Hat, Cardston Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues in this House on the anniversary of the attack in Parliament Hill. I want to give respect to those who lost their lives serving our country, and to those who that day were willing to do so to protect those in this place. I'll be spending my time as well with my colleague from Cypress Hills Grassland. Mr. Speaker, I rise to my colleague's motion on combating violence and radical extremists, in particular the ISIS terrorists who have fought against Canada, our allies, and attempted to establish a regime based on hate, intolerance, slavery, and violence. The Liberal reintegration plan and promise of funding for these returning ISIS terrorists is to welcome people back to Canada who have rejected everything we hold as values in this country, and worse, to feel the victims of their violence. This motion is based on the efforts and advocacy of Nobel Peace Laureate Nadia Murad, whose family was killed by ISIS fighters and was enslaved, abused, and raped. We know her story only because of her bravery to fight to escape and the courage to share her story. She has been outspoken and an advocate against ISIS's human trafficking, abuse of women and children, radicalization, murder, and destruction. As a Yazidi, she was oppressed for having religious views that conflicted with that of ISIS. Ms. Murad is the kind of person that Canada can and should welcome as a refugee, someone who needs support and help, who is fleeing persecution. Instead, we are providing refuge and support to returning ISIS terrorists who inflicted such horrific and life-shattering experiences on tens of thousands. The Prime Minister's response to these terrorists, the rapists, murderers, and terrorists returning to Canada is sadly funding. He announced all returning terrorists would have counselling. Most Canadians would say they need to be locked up. Their rehabilitation should not come at the cost of Canadians. And they should never be in the same area as victims who have come to Canada for safety. And yet, that's the exact policy under this Liberal government. The Minister of Public Safety repeated over and over again that the government would use all available resources to track these individuals. But we know that, just to be accurate, this is about as accurate as their other broken promises. So if every tool is to be used, I guess the question would be, how many peace bonds and monitoring warrants does the RCMP currently have on ISIS terrorists? How many are they monitoring daily for spreading their radicalized views and planning violence? Well, at last count, none that we're aware of. At least 60 terrorists returning to Canada, and none of them are under full scrutiny of the law. Because just monitoring alone isn't good enough. These people should be facing justice and prosecutions for their actions. These are crimes against humanity, and allowing such people to live and continue their hateful ways only further endangers Canadians. This Parliament looked at and debated C-59, the Liberals' attempted national security bill that could have dealt with these issues, tackling violent extremists. We heard from security and intelligence experts who told us of the real threats, but instead of giving tools to prosecutors, to police, to our security teams to go after these kinds of extreme actions, C-59 further ties the hands of police and our national security agencies. It restricts information sharing, telling national security agencies that administration and privacy are more important than stopping terrorist attacks. C-59 makes it harder for police to get court-approved orders like peace bonds and recognizance orders designed to ensure that police can proactively protect Canadians by stopping attacks. The Liberals eliminated the criminal offence on advocating for terrorism. In Canada, it's no longer a criminal offence to promote a terrorist cause. An ISIS terrorist can come to Canada, get government funding, and not be prosecuted for sharing their hate. Canadians believe that's shameful, Mr. Speaker. All these new rules and oversight bodies amounts to a cut to security and intelligence operations of $100 million, so that already underfunded agencies are less able to protect Canadians and our interests. And in a bit of final irony, the Liberals rejected the idea of ensuring that information of crimes committed overseas could be used in a criminal court without jeopardizing national security. When a Canadian goes overseas and fights for ISIS, there is generally limited court admissible evidence. There are very few or no witnesses to speak to the horrors inflicted on innocent people like Nadia Murad. All the information would need to come through national security intelligence teams. But today, we can't use that information. For that evidence to come forward, it would require full disclosure of how that evidence was gathered. That could mean endangering Canadian operatives. It could mean endangering informants or others from an allied country. Conservatives sought to address this issue by allowing evidence into the courts at the discretion of a judge without jeopardizing national security, similar to almost every other country, including our allies. The Liberals rejected these claims and these changes outright, making even more absurd. They claim to be doing everything possible to bring genocide terrorists to justice, while at the same time creating barriers to police and security teams and opposing measures to bring these terrorists to justice. This Liberal government has failed to protect Canadians at every opportunity. And now, entering their last year in government, Canadians will be taking note. So what should we be doing? Let's first focus on bringing the perpetrators of genocide and terrorist acts to justice and ensure courts have access to evidence gathered against suspected terrorists. Let's strive to keep Canadians safe from those who are suspected of committing acts of terrorism or genocide but have returned to Canada by ensuring that security agencies would be adequately resourced to provide high levels of monitoring and surveillance of their activities in Canada. We must encourage greater use of the tools to place conditions on these suspected of terrorism activities such as recog orders and peace bonds. But Liberals are making it harder for security officials to do just that and to monitor our suspected terrorists. The current processes to bring perpetrators of atrocity crimes to justice are slow and they fail victims. Canada should lead immediate reforms to ensure justice is swift. Canada should also support initiatives which take concrete action to bring justice and treatment to women whose bodies have been used as a weapon of war. We should support initiatives such as the one proposed by Premier Doug Ford to ensure that terrorists who have returned to Canada are restricted from taking advantage of Canada's generous social programs as part of the reintegration. Government should be listening to what Canadians want on this matter. And what Canadians want is justice. They want to see these criminals face prosecution and be penalized in Canada or at an international tribunal. We should fix the gap in evidence by ensuring police have the tools to act on known threats, that recog orders and peace bonds can be accessed by police to the courts, and the police are properly resourced to take action. We should restore the ability to strip violent extremists of their Canadian citizenship. It is not a Canadian value to rape, murder, and pillage. And we should not let anyone involved in such activities be able to call themselves Canadian. The answer to ISIS terrorists who want to come back to Canada should be no, absolutely not. In my Canada, our Canada, is not a refuge for terrorism and terrorists. It should be a refuge for people like Nadia Murad. We should listen to the stories of women, children, and religious minorities who've had their lives destroyed, their families killed. We should listen to Ms. Murad and her calls for justice. All Canadians support bringing terrorists to justice. And in just under 1 year, many of the government benches will understand that in Canada, the silent majority often wields a very strong voice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire? Alors, le député de Rivière-des-Mille-Îles.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'ai écouté mon collègue avec grande attention de l'autre côté de l'allée. Et puis, je me demande comment il se sent comme étant conservateur, étant donné que le bilan des conservateurs au niveau du financement de la sécurité, le RCMP, les services secrets, ils ont coupé énormément d'argent dans tous ces services-là. Et c'est justement pour surveiller et prévenir les actes terroristes. Alors, j'aimerais entendre mon honorable collègue sur ce qu'il pense de ça.
Member for Medicine Hat, Cardston, Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague across the way for the question. Unfortunately, what that question really did is mislead Canadians and speak specifically to a 2014 action by the previous government that cut excess fat from the back office of these agencies, not operational funding and frontline personnel. In fact, year over year, for the decade the Conservatives were in power, were in government, there was a 1/3 increase in operational spending for the RCMP and national security agencies. There was no funding to frontline operational personnel. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague from Medicine Hat, Cardston, Warner. The entire debate today is premised on a narrative that there are welcoming arms for ISIS fighters in this country, and I don't think that is true. The other thing that the honourable member from Medicine Hat, Cardston, Warner said was that it is no longer the case that it is illegal to promote terrorism in Canada or join a terrorist organization. And unless I misheard him, which is why I wanted to ask the question, that's certainly not true. I worked hard on Bill C-59 as it went through the House. Bill C-51, I also worked on that one in the previous Parliament. That one created an offence that is unknown in law, promoting terrorism, quote unquote, in general. It's not something that anyone could identify. It was basically thought chill. It was a dangerous provision. It actually would make it harder to fight terrorism in Canada under Bill C-51 under the Harper administration. The new bill absolutely makes it an offense to promote terrorism, not in general, but to promote terrorism. So I'm wondering if he can clarify, and if he genuinely believes that it's not illegal to promote terrorism in Canada. I'll bring him a copy of Bill C-59.
The honourable member for Medicine Hat, Cardston, Warner.
Well, thank you for my colleague for the question. I don't need a copy of C-59. I've read it. And what C-59 does is water down our national security and RCMP and policing agencies' ability to do exactly that, and that is to fight terrorism. It makes it a lot more difficult for them to share information, from one agency to another agency in Canada to share information on terrorists, on those returning, on those activities in the country. They have, with C-75 and other acts, have made it a minor criminal, a hybrid offense to be participating in these sort of activities. And for anyone to suggest that C-59 is an improvement across the board over C-51, to me, has missed the swing of the pendulum when it comes to actually protecting Canadians and national security.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I find it's truly amazing when you hear from Conservative members that try to give a false impression. You know, when Harper was the Prime Minister, when you take a look at those returning from abroad that had accusations of different sorts, not one, from what I understand, was actually charged by the RCMP. Zero. And what we have, Mr. Speaker, is not only better legislation through Bill C-59 and outstanding work that was done from this government on that project, but we've actually seen charges being laid by RCMP, and at least 50% of them where there's been convictions. I see that as a positive thing. Not only a government that talks about it, but actually does sing about it. Contrast that to the Conservatives that actually cut $1 billion, almost $1 billion, in order that dealt with issues such as terrorism. Can you explain the hypocrisy to me?
The honourable member for Medicine Hat, Cardston, Warner.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll take the speech from disguised as a question from the other side and say this. Under the previous government, late in the mandate, the law was allowed for people to be charged for traveling to commit a terrorist offense or to be involved in terrorism. 3 individuals were charged under the previous government, and you have to appreciate it was late in the mandate that this came into effect. One of those individuals went to trial this summer. The other 2 are presumed dead. So that information is completely contrary to what our member across the way would have, who likes to mislead this House in the best of times. But as far as the funding, I think it's appropriate to say that, as I said before, the funding increased for frontline operations for RCMP and national security by 1/3 in the decade that the Conservatives were in government. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Cypress Hills, Grasslands.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's actually interesting to hear the response across the way when my friend here actually tells the truth. They're laughing. They think it's a joke. But the reality is their talking points have been off all day because people have been charged. They were charged when our government was in power. 3 of them were charged. 2 of them are considered to be or presumed to be dead. The other person did go to trial, and as far as I know, that trial is still ongoing. So the Liberals can do what they want to mislead people. I see they're heckling across the way right now, trying to disrupt the proceedings this afternoon as well. But their talking points consistently today have been inaccurate, and I don't know why they would mislead people on terrorism-related issues. I wonder why that would happen, Mr. Speaker. We know full well how weak they are on this very issue. I want to talk about the last part of our motion today. We've talked a lot about ISIS and talked about them paying taxpayers' dollars to terrorists and giving them money for that kind of thing, trying to reintegrate terrorists back into Canada, welcome them back, working with other countries actually to bring citizens of, if you want to call it Canadian citizens of convenience back here, where our government's volunteering to help, where citizens of own countries don't want them to come back. But I want to talk about a little bit of a different issue this afternoon than some other people have spoken of, and that is about this plan that they're supposed to bring in 45 days, because the Liberals have said they're going to support, apparently, this motion that we brought forward, and it calls for a plan to bring to justice anyone who is in Canada, has had Canadian citizenship, has fought as a terrorist or participated in a terrorist activity. I would like to take a little bit of a view of the reciprocal of that repatriation plan and talk about the people and the places that are most impacted by what has happened, and that would be the victims and those who have become refugees. And I think the government should consider this in their plan for the future, because we're not only dealing with terrorists, we're dealing with the impact on many other people as well. And I think in the way we need to, in the future rather, we need to address these people in a way that will deal with some of the problems